public meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Successor Agency of September 25, 2012. May we have a roll call for the City Council?
Council members: Friedman.
Here.
Manukian.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Weaver. Mayor Quintero.
Here. We have a roll call for the Successor Agency.
Board members: Friedman.
Here.
Manukian.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Weaver. Here. Chair Quintero.
Here. May we have your report?
Agenda for the September 25th, 2012 joint public meeting of the City Council and Successor Agency was posted on Thursday, September 20th, 2012 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Mr. Ochoa.
Yes, sir. We have.
Taken to the American Airways.
Before we do that, there is the minutes of the joint City Council and Successor Agency meeting of Tuesday, September 18th, 2012, awaiting approval.
I'll move the minutes.
Thank you.
Minutes stand approved as submitted.
And the item before you today is Director of Community Development regarding Successor Agency properties, loans receivable, and other agreements. At 2A is Successor Agency resolution authorizing and directing the processing of documentation confirming its ownership of certain properties, loans receivable, and other agreements. 2B is Council resolution authorizing and directing the processing of documentation reflecting ownership of certain properties, loans, receivables, and other agreements by the Glendale Successor Agency.
Mr. Ochoa.
Yes, sir. We have a very brief report for you here that will sound very familiar to you. In the wake of the elimination of redevelopment under AB 1X26, the city, or rather the redevelopment agency, former redevelopment agency, conveyed a great deal of its property and assets to the city, the host city, in this case the city of Glendale. With cleanup legislation, AB 1484, some revisions were made where much of that has to be reconfirmed before the new statute. So with that, our our principal officer for economic development and asset management, Mr. Lanzafame, will give you the details.
Successor Agency. Action for you. In March of 2011, we did transfer properties and receivables to the city. At the time, we thought that that would be the best way to protect those assets. Given the legislation in AB 26 and the following legislation in AB 1484, it is now incumbent upon us to return those assets to the Successor Agency.
Return them?
To return them to the Successor Agency. As was noted, it's been ordered by legislation, by the Department of Finance. They have asked for that to happen, and then it is in our best interest to have those returned to the Successor Agency. We will have the opportunity to look at these properties again when you review the long-range asset management plan sometime next spring.
Why is it in our best interest to return them?
If the city were to keep those assets, we would have to place a value on them, and then they would deduct the amount of property tax that we receive, the same amount of property tax we receive, in effect having to pay for those properties again. That would mean we would come up short in paying our obligations. So we'll return those to the Successor Agency. There is a freeze on disposing of those assets until we do this long-range plan. At that time, we can look at it again and say, are there properties that the city should retain? And that would be the appropriate time to do it.
Question.
So,
this list of 12 properties, was there any consideration that we paid to the redevelopment agency in return for the transfer?
There was not. It was part of some cooperation agreements that were also deemed void. And so there was no compensation paid.
But ultimately, these are, the ultimate intention of the state is that these assets now in the hands of the Successor Agency will be forced to be sold, correct? Isn't that essentially where we're going?
Well, that's what we thought initially with AB X126. 1484 does provide for some of those to perhaps stay with the host city. And we'll be looking at that further. Ms. Van Meiden has been working with a legal group that is trying to interpret and work with Sacramento to try and interpret how that would come out. Again, we'll be coming back to you with a long-range asset management plan in the spring, and there may be some cases where we say it's important for these properties to stay with the host city.
Some of the nuance that we were dealing with respect to the potential fire sailing of assets that we have was recognized in the cleanup legislation, and as a result, the legislature, to their credit, wanted to slow that train down just a little bit and allow us to do this long-range asset management plan to make sure that they were not opening themselves up, or us, to be penny-wise and pound-foolish with respect to disposing of assets.
Is there any litigation currently between our city and the state, I guess, on this?
We dismissed everything that we had because we had a favorable result. There is some legislation, and Ms. Van Meiden can talk more about it. Litigation, I'm sorry, that is being proposed from other cities that may affect us.
I mean, here's my position. I don't trust the state. The fact that they're slowing down or easing up, is a matter of just slowing down the executioner's blade, in my opinion. And I think that if these are going to be transferred back to the successor agency, there's got to be some lien or something that we can, a poison pill that we can attach to these properties so it doesn't go on the open market auction block and we get some totally inappropriate purchaser owning, pick any one of these, and they're generally very prime properties in Glendale. I don't want that to happen, and that's my concern.
Two comments. The first is that in slowing down the train, they've actually suspended the sale of those properties. So no properties are to be sold unless they're under contract to be sold, and then you would enforce those obligations. So the law says you're not obligated to fire sale those until you do this asset management plan. In envisioning that plan going forward, we would start to parse out who we think should be owning those properties. For instance, the Alex Theater. That shouldn't be sold to anybody that just wants to buy it for whatever. And we've started some of that with our zoning, but in our asset management plan, what I want to do is start to narrow and protect against the exact thing that you're talking about, so that when we go to the Department of Finance and say, we think that these properties should be sold to this type of buyer, they would approve that.
Is anyone paying taxes on these properties if it goes to the successor agency?
No.
Are they a tax exempt? They're officially recognized tax exempt?
Correct.
Organizations?
Unless they're leased. For instance, the property at Central and Wilson. It'll come back to the successor agency, and there will be no tax paid on it until we convey that property for the Courtyard by Marriott project, which is an enforceable obligation. Once that happens, then they will pay a possessory interest tax, just like the Galleria pays and others. Staff recommends approval on it so we can make that transfer back.
Okay, do I have a motion?
Second.
Roll call for the successor agency.
Board members: Friedman,
Yes.
Menuchyan,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Weaver, Chair Quintero.
Yes.
Second.
Roll call.
Council members: Friedman,
Yes.
Menuchyan,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Weaver, Mayor Quintero.
Yes. Next.
Motions to adjourn.
Second? Second.
Both successor agency and city council are adjourned. I will now call to order a special public meeting of the Glendale